Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 9th of April 2025, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me by video link, we have Charles Malet, Vanessa Beeley, and Sandi Adams. Now, later in the programme, we're going to be covering gene editing, the Middle East, and food security, but we're going to begin with censorship because the news today is that BitChute, the video sharing platform, has decided to shut down operations in the UK as a result of the Online Safety Act. Now, I'm going to do something I don't normally do. I'm going to read the statement in full because I just want to make it clear in their words why they've done this. So they said that after careful review and ongoing evaluation of the regulatory landscape in the United Kingdom, we regret to inform you that BitChute will be discontinuing its video sharing service for UK residents. The introduction of the UK Online Safety Act of 2023 has brought about significant changes in the regulatory framework governing content and community interactions. Notably, the Act contains sweeping provisions and onerous corrective measures with respect to content moderation and enforcement. In particular, the broad enforcement powers granted to the Regulator of Communication Services, Ofcom, have raised concerns regarding the open-ended and unpredictable nature of regulatory compliance for our platform. The BitChute platform has always operated on the principles of freedom of speech, expression and association, and strive to foster an open and inclusive environment for content creators and audiences alike. However, the evolving regulatory pressures, including strict enforcement mechanisms and potential liabilities, have created an operational landscape in which continuing to serve the UK market exposes our company to unacceptable legal and compliance risks. Despite our best efforts to navigate these challenges, the uncertainty surrounding the Online Safety Act's enforcement by Ofcom and its far-reaching implications leaves us no viable alternative but to cease normal operations in the UK. Therefore, effective immediately, BitChute platform users in the UK will no longer be able to view content produced by any other BitChute user. Because the OSA's primary concern is that members of the public will view content deemed unsafe. However, we will permit UK BitChute users to continue to post content. The significant change will be that this UK user-posted content will not be viewable by other UK users, but will be visible to other users outside the UK. Users outside the UK may comment on that content, which the creator will continue to be able to read, delete, block, reply, and flag. Users outside the UK may share UK user-produced content to other users outside of the UK as normal. In other words, for users in the UK, including content creators, the BitChute platform is no longer a user-to-UK user video sharing service. We deeply regret the inconvenience and disappointment this decision may cause to our UK users and partners. This decision was not taken lightly. It reflects our commitment to maintain the highest standards of compliance, protecting our community and ensuring that our platform remains a safe and sustainable place for creative expression globally. We recognise the value of our UK community and extend our sincerest apologies for the disruption caused by this necessary step. Our support teams remain available to answer any queries or concerns regarding this transition. We appreciate the support and engagement of our community around the world and remain dedicated to providing a platform that champions free expression and innovative content sharing in an environment of regulatory certainty. Thank you for your understanding. Now, I'm going to say that's the end of their statement, but I'm going to say that I do understand this absolutely. But of course, for UK users, the way to deal with this is to use a VPN, which everyone should be doing by default anyway, because particularly since the requirement under the investigatory powers legislation for internet service providers to collect all the metadata for every website you visit on behalf of the British regime. So this is another platform falling in the UK. Charles, I'd be interested to get your comments on this because it follows on, of course, as we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. The announcement of small forums shutting down because of the restrictions imposed by the regulatory regime around so-called user-to-user platforms. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think in the first instance, although it's not expressly written down in the Online Safety Act 2023, I think this is precisely the consequence that they have been intending to engineer. Now, of course, with the assistance of Ofcom, who, as they point out, have been handed enforcement tools to the tune of being able to fine astronomical fees. So this is really exactly what was hoped to be delivered, the shutting down of free speech and indeed the gifting of the space to magnify the narrative by the mainstream who do not fall foul of this. And, I used a rather crass analogy, but what this has done is to turn responsibility for an action into that of the holder or the hoster of the platform. And I said it would be a bit like a pub being held liable if a fight broke out inside it. Now, unless the pub had specifically conducted an action to incite such violence, then why on earth should it be held liable? But in this instance, of course, BitChute, anybody that has what's described as user-to-user content is now being held liable. So I can appreciate exactly what it is they're saying. I think, of course, it's regrettable that they're not minded to challenge it, because we at UK Column certainly believe that the first port of call is to challenge this in the strongest possible terms.
Well, that's absolutely right. But of course, by doing what they're doing, they're vastly raising the profile of the situation. So that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it has. I mean, I think the majority of people will, of course, be blissfully unaware of this, and indeed, what possible gain does the mainstream have for reporting this? Absolutely none at all. They fund Ofcom, and therefore they're to be protected by it. So, you are quite right, and I think BitChute, is fairly well known across the board. So hopefully there will be that sort of effect. I mean, I think that's what we have to hope for. And of course, that people are watching this are going to continue to put that word out. I think that there is that sort of degree of separation, people not really understanding how freedom of speech is absolutely directly affected by this.
Yes, and I'll just end by reinforcing the idea of using a virtual private network, a VPN, because although they don't do what they claim to do in terms of privacy and protection and so on, at least getting your connection to the internet outside of UK jurisdiction means it is much harder for the UK government to snoop on which websites you're visiting and so on. And of course, it gets around this particular limitation if you happen to be in the UK. Now, related to this, of course, is data protection. And let's just remind ourselves about the UK's Data Use and Access Bill. It's been mentioned many times on this programme, along with its predecessor, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. Now, the main features of this bill are all-encompassing. I'll try that again. The main features of this all-encompassing bill include a huge relaxation of data sharing rules. It expands the definition of what are classed as legitimate interests. It creates new powers for the Secretary of State to amend the scope of Article 9 of the UK GDPR prohibition on the processing of special categories of personal data. Now, what are those? Well, that's things like political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, genetic data, biometric data, health data, these kinds of things. And it also removes cross-border restrictions on data sharing, allowing the mass export of data to the United States in particular. Now, this needs to be seen in the context, I believe, of Operation Stargate and the massive building out of the AI-powered bulk data processing capability, which was announced by the Trump regime immediately following his inauguration. So it should perhaps come as no surprise then that the EU, which has until now been famous for its regulatory regimes, is moving in the same direction as it possibly can. The European Commission has now finalised its plans to simplify and potentially remove many of the regulatory requirements imposed by the General Data Protection Regulation, otherwise known as GDPR, which has until now been widely seen as the global lead in data protection legislation, but not for much longer. So according to Michael McGrath, who is the European Commissioner overseeing data privacy laws, the aim of the exercise here is to, quote, improve the competitiveness of the European economy through a whole range of simplification measures. Recently, he said it's an objective of the European Union to continue with full implementation and enforcement of the data privacy framework, and he also announced the EU's intention to permit data sharing with US companies. It's my expectation, he said, because of the mutual benefits that it provides for European companies, for American companies, that there's a willingness on both sides of the Atlantic to continue with this. So the question is, will Trump put tariffs on data? I suspect not. But meanwhile, here in the UK, the Apple saga continues to rumble on. And if you remember, under the latest iteration of investigatory powers claimed by the Starmer regime, the UK government demanded that Apple provide a backdoor to encrypted data on Apple's iCloud data storage infrastructure, and Apple refused to comply. Instead, they removed the ability to enable advanced data protection functionality on Apple devices here in the UK, and they then took the case to the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which is the court responsible for overseeing the use of this legislation. But those hearings were to be held in secret. So a group of privacy campaigners, including Open Rights Group, Big Brother Watch, and Index on Censorship, took this issue to the tribunal, and a judge has ruled that the hearings should be heard in public. So the tribunal said that it did not accept that the revelation of the bare details of the case would be damaging to the public interest or prejudicial to national security. And this is a good step in the right direction. The Investigatory Powers Act and its recent amendments are really an anathema to data protection, and anything which helps expose it for what it is good news. But the key point here is that while you and I want our data to be private, and Apple, for marketing reasons, perhaps wants that to be private as well, the regime in this country does not want that to be private. And worse than that, they want the fact that they don't want it to be private to be private. So that means that under this legislation, if you remember, it is against the law for a tech company to let any individual know that the spooks have demanded access to their personal data. Again, Charles, any thoughts on this? Because this is, I think, a bit of a win.
Well, I mean, yes, I suppose we have to be a little bit guarded in what we really do regard as a win in the first instance. But no, I mean, I would absolutely totally agree with that. I think there's like with all of these sorts of topics, I think that the main point is the hope that this goes out to a wider audience and that people do actually get some sense of not just what is going on, but what has been going on. Of course, this is something that's been covered on the news in its various guises for so many years, and yet the traction that it gains is invariably very, very little, and often when it is appreciated exactly what the situation is, in effect the door has closed and it's too late. But yes, I would absolutely agree. I mean, let's just hope that we can put it down as a win.
Okay, thank you for that, Charles. Now let's come on to what you're calling a digital prison.
I'm calling it a digital prison. I'm referring to what's happened just yesterday with the news that Companies House is to introduce a new verification scheme for identity. Of course, the word verify creeping into virtually everything that pertains to online or digital activity, as though in some way it confers the idea of security, which is one of the main selling points. But the reason for describing it as a prison is it seems that the walls are in effect closing in, or there is an attempt for the walls to close in from directions over which people have very little control. So, of course, Companies House is the conduit that draws people in who are going to be conducting any sort of business activity, at least in the first instance, where they're incorporating their organisation, and indeed they're going back to Companies House to file all the various documents that are required over the course of the year. So it should be made clear that, first of all, this is not going to affect the records that are already on the Companies House book, but this will take a future effect. And the reason that this is happening is because of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act going back to 2023. Now, it really has a rather misleading title, as I'll go on to articulate, but it said that the role of the Act was to reform the role of Companies House and improve transparency over UK companies and other legal entities to strengthen our business environment, support our national security, and disrupt economic crime. Now, I think it's questionable as to whether any of those things will be achieved, certainly not all of them, and certainly not via the mechanism of that particular piece of legislation. But there will be certain other consequences which I would imagine are fairly predictable and therefore have been engineered into the system, one of which is reported by the UK cybersecurity sectoral analysis of this year, published quite recently by the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And of course, no great surprise, but the industry has swelled by over 12% in the last year and now delivers a return of just over £13 billion. And I think we can expect an exponential increase there. And of course, the important point to note is that many organizations in that field are in effect covering both sides of the fence by saying that they're going to provide the security, but also providing the systems themselves that require the security. So it's all fairly well covered off, one might say. Now, this obviously relates to the the notion of digital identity. I just think it would be worth remembering the facile terms in which the government put their message for this in order to try to convince people that it was a good idea. So here's Peter Kyle, the minister for the department we've just been speaking about, trying to advertise this product.
Right, mate?
Hi, mate. Can I get a pint of lager, please?
Yeah, of course. Can I just use my details?
Yeah, no worries. I've got it somewhere in here.
Hi, can I have a pint of Christmas cracker, please?
Certainly.
I know it's a surprise for everyone, but I don't get asked for my ID anymore. But for loads of young people, they get asked all the time when they want to buy a drink. So we're changing the law so that next Christmas, young people will have their ID on their phone, so they won't have all of the hassle of needing to get ID or leaving their ID at home, or their paper ID getting lost or damaged. There's already 50 digital apps like this one. But what it means is that bar staff can scan to prove somebody's identity, and it doesn't give away any personal information. So it means that giving your ID is safer than it's ever been before. Changes like these are going to create economic growth for our country, which is key to our plan for change.
There you are.
Great, thanks. You can put it on the tab. So this means by next Christmas, buying a pint will be a little bit easier.
Well, I'm not sure if it would have been able to cram any more untruths into such a short video clip, but he had a fairly good go at it. Of course, first thing to note might be that the government minister didn't try to help a member of the public who just dropped something right next to him, which I thought was quite indicative. But the point is that he is really honestly trying to make a case for security and convenience versus the possibility that you might occasionally drop something that is physical on the floor, and that's really his only selling point. But this is the direction that we are to be consistently pushed, and that's why this verification scheme that Companies House is trying to roll out is just yet another trap by which people are going to be ensnared and forced into something that really has absolutely no benefit and plenty of risk. And that's what I want to go on to talk about, because a report has been published by Thales, of all people, the defence business, of course, who stand to gain in this theatre, and they've constructed a report where they say that they're concerned about digital identity storage on mobile telephones. Of course, exactly what Peter Carl's been talking about, but he's suggesting, they're all trying to suggest that because it's digital and there's a biometric security verification, that it therefore is impregnable, which could not really be further from the truth. And so this is referring to people who've got images stored of identity documents, and therefore there's a low security threshold there, and therefore there should be a mechanism by which we're able to deal with that via this much vaunted idea of digital ID. And so let's just have a quick look at some of the companies that are involved in this space and will be holding some of the infrastructure that we are supposed to rely on, one of them being Capgemini. And here's a piece from Hedgehog talking about 20 gigabytes of sensitive information having been stolen. Now, the reason I've highlighted them is because I put in a Freedom of Information request to the Ministry of Defence recently about the veteran ID card in order to find out who's going to be dealing with the data, because it certainly isn't going to be the Ministry of Defence. And as seen on screen now, it says the main third-party provider of support to the development of the digital card service is a company called Capgemini. So it's a fail for them. The next one we look at is a data breach reported here by Bearings Law. And in this instance, we're talking about Shared Services Connected Limited, SSCL. And again, in response to the Freedom of Information request I put in, they state, the Ministry of Defence state that personal information of veterans applying for the digital veteran card will be processed and held by Shared Services Connected Limited. So they don't get it right either. Next, of course, and entirely probably, the whole Companies House infrastructure is run by Amazon Web Services. So first of all, we've got the enormous conflict of interest when we're looking at transparency and how companies actually conduct their business. And it's worth noting that Amazon paid no corporation tax between 2020 and 2024. And yet here they are providing the very basis upon which Companies House is trying to build all this nonsense. So We then see that Amazon Web Services, of course, certainly many government services on the back of it, but they've had plenty of breaches as well. So that doesn't work either. And I think it's beginning to look increasingly like dropping your wallet on the pub floor might be the best possible outcome. And just to round this off, it's worth noting that all this goes full circle because if there is an issue with this, who do you get in touch with via the outsourced contact center service? None other than Hinduja Global Solutions, and they are indeed part of the many businesses that the Hinduja brothers involved in the 2001 cash for passport scandal with Peter Mandelson refers back to. So really just an absolute nest of incompetence and dishonesty, and frankly, what should be another nail in the coffin of digital identity.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for that. Now, let's move to the Middle East then. And Vanessa, what's going on? Escalation happening in the region?
Yeah, definitely. It looks like some kind of escalation, but I would also say it's very much about fake news, both in the UK, the EU, and the US, to try and portray Iran as severely weakened prior to the indirect or direct, according to Trump, talks that are going to take place in Oman on Saturday. So let's have a quick look at a few of the reports that have been coming out in the last few days. So first of all, there was a claim, and actually this was in the Telegraph, Iran abandons Houthis under relentless US bombardment. This was a claim that Iranian advisors were fleeing Yemen under the US heavy bombardment, which of course has been denied both by Ansarullah in Yemen and by Iran itself. And of course, the fact is that while Trump is claiming that the US aggression has basically beaten Ansarullah back, of course it hasn't. The missiles are still coming both towards the occupied territories of Palestine and towards US and Israeli shipping in the Red Sea. Then this report came out again very recently. Iran-backed Iraqi militias consider disarming amid threats from the Trump administration. Again, this is denied, but it was picked up by, let's say, soft Zionist media in Haaretz, which we can have a look at that report. Again, it talks about with disarmament of militias in Iraq, Iran signals a major strategic shift. It's saying that pro-Iranian militias, of course, again, describing them almost as proxies of Iran, which is untrue, have agreed to disarm, but it doesn't necessarily indicate a weakening of Iran's power in Iraq, but does point to Tehran recalibrating its strategy following the blows to its ring of fire, which of course include Lebanon, Palestine, and the international coup in Syria last December. So effectively, what it's trying to say is that Iran is in a weakened position. It's prepared to compromise during the talks on Saturday in Oman. This is an article, again, in what I would call as a sort of soft, centrist Israeli media. As reconstruction stalls in Lebanon, victims of Israeli strikes, which was during the previous war between Hezbollah and Israel, say they won't bow to US pressure to normalize with Israel. So what is the US trying to do? It's trying to withhold funding for the reconstruction of the south, and that includes the southern suburbs of Beirut, through the IMF and the World Bank, which of course is a very typical strategy of the United States. On the 6th of April, the US envoy Morgan Otargis came to Lebanon, and of course she is pushing for the full disarmament of Hezbollah, again using the threats that IMF and World Bank won't put any funding into the rebuilding of Lebanon, but also threatening that the US will withdraw from the Oversight Committee, which effectively will give Israel full freedom to act in the south without any kind of calibration by the United States. Next, false report. Hezbollah is apparently ready for disarmament talks if Israel withdraws from South Lebanon. Well, Israel should have already withdrawn under the original ceasefire agreement. And in reality, what this is trying to do is to go for not only the withdrawal of Hezbollah from the southern region to the north of the Litani River, which is part of the UN Resolution 1701, which was part of the ceasefire agreement. But as I've mentioned, of course, Israel has maintained its presence, military presence, in 5 areas of the south, 5 strategic high areas from which it is on a regular basis attacking civilians in that area. But it's also been carrying out airstrikes on a regular basis, drone surveillance, drone strikes, drone assassination. So it's not at all holding to the ceasefire agreement. And then yesterday, this was a major report that came out in Saudi Arabian media. Of course, Saudi Arabia working regularly to reinforce a Zionist agenda in the region.
And it looks like we have lost Vanessa, unfortunately. She'll be back in a second. But anyway, there is a final. You're back. No, you're not back.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back, yes. Okay, right. Sorry, you were talking about Iran's Al-Quds special forces used Beirut port to smuggle weapons for Hezbollah.
Yeah, which of course is clearly untrue, but it may signal an attack by Israel on the port itself. We could hear Israeli jets in the skies yesterday. And finally, there were reports on social media that there were special US representatives landed in Israel yesterday for talks, but also Ben Gvir, one of the most extremist members of Netanyahu's government, has embarked on an official visit to the US after being boycotted by Biden administration. So what we seem to be seeing is a build-up of stories to facilitate some kind of escalation, but also prior to the meeting on Saturday between Stephen Witkoff and the Iranian representatives.
Thank you for that. Well, more for the Middle East just after the ad break. So let's have a look at this. If you like what the UK column does, you'd like to support us, support.ukcolumn.org is the place to go. And you can join us. You can make a donation. You can join us as a member. These are 2 different things. If you want to watch UK Column News Extra, please make sure you join as a member. And there are various time periods that you can join over. You can pick something up from the UK Column shop, and we still have a few t-shirts from the event at the weekend, and those will be going up in the shop in the next day or 2. Or if you would like to get something from clivetokar.com, if you use the link on this page, we get a small commission on that. But if you can't do any of that, that's absolutely fine. But please do at least share the material you see on the UK Column website. And we prefer if you share content from the website rather than sharing stuff that's on the platforms. The share links are provided. And of course, you can use other platforms if you wish. Now, yesterday's interview, Thinking with Your Heart, this was yours, Charles.
It was indeed absolutely terrific. It's gone down really well. So I'd very much encourage you to get a good listen to Jonathan Marshall, who I met last year at a country show. He performs with an amazing stallion and falcons, but he addresses what he describes as the anti-nature agenda absolutely perfectly. And it's a really, really delightful and uplifting interview. So please do have a listen.
Thank you, Charles. And tomorrow at 1 p.m, Brian will be putting out the second part of his discussion with Karl Schwartz on 9/11. And so do join us at 1 p.m. for that if you possibly can. There is a Glasgow Peace Walk being run by Stand for Peace. It's taking place on the 12th of April, 2025 at 12 p.m, St. Enoch Square. Details on screen. The details will be in the show notes as well. Please get to that if you possibly can. And Diane has asked us to highlight this crowdfunder on Give Send Go for this is legal defense for slap suits against freedom of speech. This is sorry, Charles, can you remind me who this is, because this completely fallen out of my head?
I'm afraid to say I can't help. I don't I don't know who that is, so I'm terribly sorry to everybody.
I do apologize. Well, I do apologize for that, as this is live and it's completely fallen out of my head. So anyway, the details will be in the show notes for that as well. So do please support that if you can. This is about what's going on in libraries and freedom of speech, defamation lawsuits, and all kinds of stuff around that in the United States. But nonetheless, it should be of importance to everybody. Vanessa, let me come back to you then. And well, we're looking at Iran again, but what's obviously Netanyahu was meeting Trump in the last day or two. So what were they saying?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to play this excerpt from the meeting, or rather the press conference between Trump and Netanyahu, which was what Trump said on the upcoming Iran meeting. So let's just roll this.
Wait. We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious. And the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it. But it's getting to be very dangerous territory. And hopefully those talks will be successful. And I think it would be in Iran's best interest if they are successful. We hope that's going to happen.
So here Trump basically is saying, despite the reports saying that these talks would be indirect talks, in other words, they would be overseen or moderated, let's say, by Oman, he's now saying they're direct talks with his envoy, Stephen Witkoff. And Reuters picked this up, said Trump says US-Iran set for direct nuclear talks. Tehran says that they will be indirect. And in fact, the Iranian foreign minister went on X immediately after to basically point out that as far as he's concerned, if we can just put the tweet up, Iran and the United States will meet in Oman on Saturday for indirect high-level talks. It is as much an opportunity as it is a test. The ball is in America's court. Interesting that everybody seems to be using the ball in the court analogies, including, of course, the United States and Trump over the Russian-Ukraine negotiations. But I think for me, what this signals is America is basically setting Iran up for failure by Trump saying this will be a direct talk, by Iran basically saying, no, we maintain that they should be indirect talks. There is potential, of course, for the United States and its slavish media to basically portray Iran as being obstructive, even prior to the talk. So we'll wait and see. And that, of course, in the context of the previous reports suggesting Iran's weakness in the region and the weakness of its allies that are under threat, but are certainly not as weak as they're being portrayed by Trump and Western media. So we will see what happens on Saturday.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Now, Dan Kleiman was who the crowdfunder was for. I do apologize, Dan. I'm very sorry about that. I'm very embarrassed. But there we go. We will move on. Now, back in March, at the beginning of March, we introduced you to this company, Colossal, the genetic manipulators who are trying to raise money for Jurassic Park, it seems. Now, if you remember, they are into gene editing to recreate what they say, so let's quote this, the lost megafauna and other creatures of the past, but only the ones they say that had a measurably positive impact on our fragile ecosystems, like the woolly mammoth, if you remember. They hope that having mammoths running around the Arctic tundra will encourage grasses to grow, which will capture loads of carbon dioxide. So if you remember, they gene edited a mouse to give it long hair as the first step to getting to the woolly mammoth. But don't worry, they'll only start experimenting on actual elephants when they're convinced the process is safe and effective. Well, anyway, they've taken a step forward with the creation of 3 dire wolves. So this is the announcement page on their website. The 3 dire wolves are called Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, in a sop to Game of Thrones, at least the last one is. where dire wolves were a thing. Colossal says that on the 1st of October 2024, for the first time in human history, Colossal successfully restored a once eradicated species through the science of de-extinction. After a 10,000 plus year absence, our team is proud to return the dire wolf to its rightful place in the ecosystem. Colossal's innovations in science, technology, and conservation made it possible to accomplish something that's never been done before, the revival of a species from its long-standing population of 0. Well, of course, this is total nonsense. The reality is that they took an existing animal, a grey wolf, and they played with its genome very slightly. They, in fact, adjusted 14 very specific genes to make it look like the extinct dire wolf, and then they declare that they've brought back the extinct species. They didn't bring back the extinct species, and their claims are just as fictional as the CGI dire wolves in Game of Thrones. Now, remember, in this country, this nonsense is enabled by the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Act 2023. And if you remember when it was introduced, Joe Churchill, Minister for Agri-Innovation, said new genetic technologies could help us tackle some of the biggest challenges of our age around food security, climate change, and biodiversity loss. But as Charles reported some time ago, this isn't just about vanity projects like woolly mammoths and dire wolves. This is happening to our food supply. And so the question is, what could possibly go wrong? Well, let's have a look at it, because meanwhile in Australia, efforts are afoot to deal with the cane toad problem there by genetically engineering those animals to create a cane toad tadpole which never grows up. Instead, it remains a tadpole, a cannibalistic tadpole that voraciously eats other cane toad eggs. And the nut jobs who've done this claim this will reduce the wild population of cane toads, which is out of control in Australia. Now, the project, which is a collaboration between a number of universities and foundations and also state governments, has so far received permits to run experiments in controlled settings in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. And the gene-edited tadpoles have not been tested in the wild yet, but field trials are expected in Western Australia later this year, after what they laughingly call a risk assessment. Now, the depressing irony here, of course, is that cane toads were initially released in Queensland in 1935 in order to control cane beetles, but ended up creating a bigger problem than the one that they were trying to solve in the first place. So again, I'm going to ask, what could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong, Charles?
Well, I think the list is probably limitless. And as far as I recall, when Pandora's box was opened, it was not a great outcome. So I think this is absolutely extraordinary in so many respects. I mean, it's completely beside the point whether the technology exists or not. The idea that the introduction or the removal of one species can be done in such a way as to not disrupt that ecosystem with a net negative outcome is perfectly extraordinary. Nobody knows. And so it's the same, with all of these things, to suggest that just because it can be done, that therefore somehow it's legitimate to do it, is perfectly bizarre. And you referred to the gene editing, the spring trials this year. I mean, if you read the safety data or the provisions in place to try to stop anything happening, they're absolutely laughable. It's just, you just put a 20-meter strip around the edge of a field that you're growing something in, and then you hope for the best. I mean, yes. That is it. That is literally what you do. So this is, I mean, it's a terrible joke, but it is a joke.
Absolutely. Sandi, let me welcome you to the program then, and food-related stuff, but let's look at beef prices to start off with.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I mean, obviously, we were at the UK Column Conference at the weekend, and there are a number of farmers there, which was great. So interaction with them is always good to see what's going on the ground. And there were a few very concerned beef farmers at the conference. Beef prices are rising significantly, and obviously this will affect both farmers and consumers. The decrease follows a sustained reduction in cattle numbers, influenced by factors such as declining direct payments to farmers and challenges in business profitability. Specifically, the beef female breeding herd experienced a 4.5% drop to 1.34 million per head, marking the largest annual reduction in cattle per head in the country, in the UK, ever. The tightening of supply has led to record high prices paid to farmers, which are called farm gate prices, which is really the price they reach at market. For instance, farmers I spoke to at the conference said that beef had formerly fetched £400 to £600 per animal at market, and it's now fetching anything up to £1,800 at market and rising. So farmers are facing high costs for feed, energy and transportation also. These combined factors have led to noticeable price increases in beef, and abattoirs play a major role in influencing the price of the beef in the UK. Even though they don't officially set the prices, they exert power in the market, often to the farmers' disadvantage. Their role is in grading, pricing and controlling access to the supply chain, gives them a sort of quasi pricing power, I think, from what I can gather. The UK meat processing industry has been consolidated in recent years down to 3 larger corporations. I mean, we're seeing this across the board with this consolidation of power to larger corporations from small and medium-sized businesses. And that's what's happened to the meat processing. And according to the Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association, a lot of the farmers feel that these companies are operating like cartels and they struggle to get a fair price at the markets. The 3 big companies that have consolidated are ABP Food Group, which is Anglo Beef Processors, and they employ about 13,000 people across divisions. And they operate in 9 countries in Europe with a turnover of 5 billion euros a year. Massive company. And there's another one called Dawn Meats, which have been sort of amalgamated with Dunbia. Now, there's a picture here of them, and they've invested 9 million in net zero climate commitments, which is what they're getting. What's happening in that photograph. They seem to be having a big conference about it, and they have something called Plan 40. Plan 40, which is targeting net zero operation emissions by 2040. So the next one is the Keepak Group. And Keepak is an Irish-owned company with significant operations in the UK. And that, again, reported a revenue of 1.2 billion in its financial year. So these are big movers and shakers. So it's not about market control. It is about market control. The dominance of these large processors means that they have substantial control over the meat supply chain, and this consolidation can limit the bargaining power of individual farmers. What we have to remember also, when going back to Dunbia, which is one of the biggest meat processors, is that they are aligning to the 17 goals. Now, given that the government net zero policies call for no meat production by 2049, will they collapse the meat processing eventually to fulfill their commitment to the plan? 40 focuses on environment, food, farming and society. And it would seem that meat production is a bit of a conflict of interest for these corporations. So what is really happening? Anyway, that aside, the recent price increase in beef is forcing some farmers to sell sooner and destock, especially those struggling with rising input costs like feed, fuel, energy, interest rates and tax. So, a lot of them fearing a price drop. There's a sort of selling and destocking, and it's keeping farmers in quite a high anxiety state, because some of them are exiting the industry altogether due to regulations or financial pressure. But in the long term, this reduces the breeding herd, which tightens the future supply and drives up the prices. So will this push up the supermarket beef price? Well, of course it will. We expect continued price hikes or smaller portion sizes in what they call shrinkflation, when they reduce the size of the product, but sell it at the same price. So also, the supermarkets could easily push the sale of cheaper lab-grown, highly processed artificial meat, and I think they will. With real meat being priced out of the supermarket, what a great opportunity to replace it with all these meatless products. Supermarkets are profit-driven, and alternative proteins offer lower production volatility and higher margins. And they also appeal to the ESG investors and net zero agendas, which are being pushed by the UN. So we've got all these agendas all pushing the meatless market, if you like. So, they've got control over, food supply chains, and they don't have to deal with stubborn farmers and activists and stuff. Now, supermarkets are already subtly nudging. They're being pressured, really, with ESG frameworks and government incentives to promote sustainable proteins, which increasingly includes, lab-grown, insect-based or plant-based substitutes. Lab-grown meat is on the horizon. It's getting regulatory approval in various markets in the UK, and that's next in line. We've got 3D printed meat. It's in its early stages, pilot testing, mostly abroad, but it's a flashy tool for shaping texture and the core product. And fake meat, obviously plant-based, is already here. In our supermarkets with products like Beyond Corn, Vivera, and it's likely to be heavily promoted if beef prices stay high. And as we know, it's all part of the UN Environment Programme to fulfil the SDG goals and to promote veganism. So this isn't just about price, it's about control and reshaping the food system. High beef prices, farmer hardship, consumer anxiety, which creates the perfect opening to push solutions aligned with net zero synthetic food economies and vertical integration, that's vertical growing. The UK government has allocated approximately 75 million towards the development of sustainable protein sources, including cultivated meat, insect protein, all of that kind of meatless agenda stuff, and to facilitate the introduction of lab-grown meat products. The Food Standard Agency has received 1.6 million to establish efficient safety assessment process for all these novel foods. Meanwhile, Morrison's and other major UK supermarkets have been closing their fresh meat and fish counters. Morrison's announced in March 2025 that they plan to close 35 meat counters and 35 fish counters by the end of April. And already Tesco and Sainsbury's have already closed their fresh fish and meat counters. Well, the supermarkets can continue with their meatless agenda and peddle inferior, highly processed meat products, fake meat products. But I think it will fail. It really is time that we moved away from the supermarkets. We know that. Yes, farmers are under pressure, but the future depends on us, really. It presents a crucial moment for consumers to make informed choices that support the farmers by prioritising high welfare and locally sourced meat and veg all those locally sourced veg and meat products. Consumers can help sustain British farmers and rural communities. While the UK beef industry faces significant challenges, it's not doomed. Instead, it's an opportunity for all of us to see it as a sector transition, requiring the support of consumers. And so really the answer depends on our collective choices. We have to support our farmers. It's in our hands. And it's a perfect opportunity for people to rethink the way they buy their food.
It certainly is, particularly if the price is getting closer in the supermarkets to good quality food that's available direct from the farms. Thanks, Sandi. And Charles, sticking with food security then.
Yeah, very closely related, but really, as Sandi articulates, the question is what is either the response of the public or indeed government to any of this? And this concerns what's being referred to as a wheat strike. The farmers encouraged by the Farming Forum to withhold wheat supplies from flour millers, which has been described as being likely to give rise to a shortage of bread and other sort of bakery products in the shops, particularly in relation to Easter weekend coming up and, of course, hot cross buns and that kind of thing. Now, I will be playing the ball and not the man, but it does bear relation to think that the person behind this is a chap called Clive Bailey, who, as I say, has been managing the Farming Forum, and it was he that was coordinating gatherers and protesters in London back in November 2024 and inviting people to register via a digital platform. Now, it was said at the time that the data was not being held, but nonetheless, there seem to be a few question marks around that. Now, another person who's been involved in this is a chap called Ollie Harrison, just shown there on the tweet. And obviously this has been pushed out by some of the usual channels. So we're just going to have a look at what he himself, Ollie Harrison, says about the intent behind this withholding of wheat.
You might be wondering why bread and hot cross buns are being short at shops at the moment, and I'll tell you why. Because milling wheat is staying on farms. Farmers that are growing milling wheat have gone on strike from the 1st of April. They will not be loading any trucks with milling wheat, and we're probably going to run out of flour, which will result in running out of hot cross buns and bread. So if you're wondering why the shelves are empty, get onto your local MP and say you need to help these farmers out. You can't carry on putting them out of business. It's not good. So yeah, if there's ration bread and cakes and hot cross buns, it's the politicians' fault. It's not our fault. We can't carry on longer or we won't be in business.
Now, I can't be sure exactly who came up with the idea or indeed what sort of take-up there's been from farmers and what the effect will be either with the millers or with the shelves in shops and supermarkets. But there do seem to have been a number of considerations that have not been taken into account, one of which is the sort of legacy effect of the poor harvest last year and indeed the effect of the environmental land management schemes that have been introduced by the previous Conservative government and then brought in and indeed changed recently by the Labour government. So we have the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board here stating that there's likely to be an increase in imports by 13%, which equates to about 2.75 million tonnes of wheat this year. So the point there is that in actual fact, if it were necessary, it seems possible to imagine that this shortfall in wheat from UK producers could easily be augmented by imports, which of course would entirely nullify any attempt at protest via that. But also, it's worth pointing out this doesn't actually affect the government, not even one bit. But it seems to be in direct response. What he's referring to is the instant withdrawal of the Sustainable Farming Incentive, SFI, and the inheritance tax changes that were made in the autumn budget. But the point with this is that SFI was not a food growing scheme in the first place. The whole point of it was that it was supposed to take land out of food production in order to supposedly benefit the environment, with the effect that 107% increase in uncropped arable land became an almost immediate consequence as the scheme was oversubscribed, which is why it's been stopped. So it's almost as though these people are wanting to have it both ways by complaining about a scheme that's been stopped, but also suggesting that food should be withheld. So it really all is leading to the same place, which is, as he quite rightly identifies, a food shortage. Now, the problem with that is that it's an absolute gift to the government because it illustrates that there is an emergency that the government needs to take control of, and that in itself is a problem. Now, the other thing I want to draw attention to is Ollie Harrison himself. I've showed this before. His pinned tweet on Twitter reads, the number of people who've died from glyphosate exposure in 40 years, 0. Number of people died from consuming GMOs in 22 years, 0. It carries on in this vein. The point is that he is very much invested in what's become a traditional and very destructive form of industrial agrochemical farming. Now, I would just like to point out that the safety data sheet from Bayer, the manufacturers of glyphosate via many of their Roundup products, runs entirely contrary to what he says. And I think people just really do need to think about this. I've just drawn out a few. To humans, it causes serious eye irritation. I mean, that would frankly be the least of your worries. It's toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. It's toxic to honeybees, our chief pollinators. And it talks about avoiding risks to human health and the environment. So this is not a good thing to be splashing about the place. And if you consider that it is applied very liberally to crops and indeed to exactly the sort of wheat he's pointing out that's going to flour millers, how is your body supposed to cope with that? First of all, it's coated in a highly toxic chemical. But secondly, that is a chemical that the crop itself is able to withstand because of various processes via either hybridization or gene editing that it's undergone. So I think that's, in relation to human health, that is something that people really do need to consider. On that score, the government have just reinforced the point that they made a change to the law in November. This is to do with birth defects, which they say are going to be prevented by fortifying flour with folic acid. Now, the drama with folic acid, they say here that they're going to fortify bread with it, reducing neural tube defects by 20% in the UK. How on earth can they know that? The answer, of course, is they can't. The NHS here saying about folic acid is available on prescription. Your doctor will explain how often to take it. Exactly like fluoride, it is a medication. It therefore requires a dosage that is appropriate to the person taking it. So to apply it liberally or in whatever quantity to a bread that you cannot regulate the consumption of is reckless in the extreme, and people should be made very, very aware of that. So we've got glyphosate and folic acid coming together. Also, to refer back to the state of emergency that the government may easily extract from this and therefore start to dictate in a way that they might not be doing now. I point back to the National Preparedness Commission, which has had specific insight into the idea that there is going to be a food security. Of course, we should bear in mind that food security is really a completely nebulous concept anyway in terms of national self-sustainability, because we have had not really more than about 50% capability for a long, long time, certainly not 100% capability since the 18th century. So this is sort of slightly arbitrary debating. Now, I would just like you to draw your attention in closing to a couple of things. First of all, I've written an article that's been on the UK Column website for a little while, but suggesting really that the chief target here is supranational. This is exactly what Sandi has been talking about. This is the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and so much else besides, but also the spectre of climate change and, of course, the nonsense that's behind that. And also, please go to the farming section on the UK Column website, where there's so much more about all of this sort of thing.
Thank you, Charles. Vanessa, let's finish off with you then, and more on the Trump and Netanyahu meeting. Don't worry about the time, just take your time and do it.
Yes, so interesting that The Economist has actually just very recently published an article talking about Turkey and Israel are becoming deadly rivals in Syria. Of course, we've been talking about that at UK Column for some time now, a few months. Now, how The Economist frames it is very much that Israel fears that Hamas will end up in Syria and under the umbrella of Turkey. Turkey fears the relationship between Israel and the Kurdish factions in the northeast of Syria. But both of them are united over the common ground of keeping Iran and Iranian influence out of the region. Now, Netanyahu has been lobbying the US, in particular Marco Rubio, who's known to be one of the most ardent pro-Zionists in the administration, although the entire administration, I would argue, is pro-Israel, pro-Zionist. So he's been regularly calling Rubio to tell him to cancel the sales of F-35s to Turkey. And I just want to roll this section of the press conference between Netanyahu and Trump, where Trump covers the Turkey issue. So let's have a look at this.
And I told the Prime Minister, I said, just, Bibi, if you have a problem with Turkey, I really think I'm going to be able to work it out. You know, I have a very, very good relationship with Turkey and with their leader, and I think we'll be able to work it out. So I hope that's not going to be a problem. I don't think it will be a problem. Now, with that being said, I believe it was Turkey, and I said that to him. I said it. I said, congratulations. You've done what nobody's been able to do in 2,000 years. You've taken over Syria with different names, but same thing. I said, you've taken it over. He's taken it over through surrogates. He goes, no, it was not me. I said, it was you. But that's okay. You don't have to say, well, sort of maybe it was me. Okay. But what he did, he's a tough guy and he's very smart. And he did something that nobody was able to do. You know, you got to hand it to him. Any problem that you have with Turkey, I think I can solve.
Now, what's interesting here is that Trump is actually laying the blame for the international coup that finally toppled the Syrian government after 14 years of regime change, which was backed by the US, the UK, the EU, the Gulf states, Israel, and suddenly it all becomes Turkey's problem. That's one aspect of this. The other thing, of course, is that Trump is pushing for deconfliction. In other words, I think what he's pushing for, because his attitude towards Israel, in my opinion, would be favorable to that of his attitude towards Turkey, even though Turkey is a NATO member state. And what's interesting is the slight change in rhetoric from Turkey, not since the meeting, but just leading up to that meeting. And of course, we can assume that there were back-channel conversations going on with Turkey. So let's have a look at what Mr. Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, has said. So he's basically saying the bottom section.
Unfortunately, Israel is taking one by one out of all these capabilities that the new state can use against ISIS and other terrorist threats.
Yeah, so basically, of course, what they're referring to is Israel's bombing of the T4 airport in Palmyra and also Hama to the south of Idlib. So they're basically making the claim that they're only installing air defense and military capabilities for Giuliani's government in Damascus in order to combat ISIS. Well, I mean, where have we heard that one before? And he says it again here, basically. Sorry, Mike, if you can just read that for me again, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, it says, so basically what Israel is doing in Syria is not only threatening the security of Syria, but also paving the way for future instability of the region. I don't think that it's good for Israel's future in the region.
Yeah, so again, we have here Turkey using the combating ISIS card, which again was used for years by the West, while of course ISIS is a proxy of the West inside Syria. So now Turkey and Israel mull a deconfliction line in Syria. So again, this is post the Trump press conference. So Trump is clearly, in my opinion, putting pressure on Turkey to back down and basically retreat behind an agreed line, which doesn't appear to yet have been finalized. But I just wanted to show here why this area in particular is so important. So I've put in a circle there, basically the area that Israel has been intensively bombing, that Turkey was planning to move forward with air defense and military capability in order to allegedly combat ISIS. But look how close that entire circle of military air bases is to the potential of Israel's expansion up that eastern corridor. So the last thing that Israel wants is a Turkish expansionism into that central Syrian area. And of course, again, just to remind everybody, Israel is looking to partition Syria. Turkey is looking to maintain a so-called unified Syria under Turkish control. And one interesting point that I just wanted to make, this actually came out in Newsweek, and it's talking about Syria's new resistance. There are a number of resistance factions forming in Syria since the international coup in December last year. But this is a fairly interesting and in-depth article on the formation of what is known as Uli al-Bas, which is effectively claiming to represent a segment of the population in southern Syria to combat Israeli expansionism in the south of Syria, which of course has been ongoing since December the 8th. So again, interesting regional developments, but the potential for conflict to some degree between Turkey and Israel is definitely still there, with the US, Trump showing that he wants to act as arbiter in that potential confrontation.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Well, we've got to leave it there for today. I'm going to say thank you very much to Vanessa, Charles, and Sandi for joining me today. Thank you all for watching. We'll be back in a few minutes for UK Column News Extra if you're a UK Column member. I won't be back for 2 weeks. I'm off on holiday, so I hope everyone has fun while I'm away. But join us for Extra in a couple of minutes if you're a member. And we'll see you on, or at least Patrick and Charles will see you on Friday as usual. See you then. Bye-bye.